Let's take a look at some water heater rating systems, and I happen to have here a rating system for a Well-McLean indirect hot water heater. Now, particularly why I'm choosing this particular one or an indirect hot water heater is in the heating field, what we will oftentimes do is we might have a boiler system that will supply the hot water to the domestic hot water tank. And we may be involved in either piping that water heater into that system, or we're going to be piping the boiler to that, but we may be just doing a water heater change out in some applications. Obviously, rules, codes have to be followed to be able to do that legally. So if you have to make sure that you are licensed to be able to do those things. But specifically, part of why we need to understand the rating system is that we're the ones that are supplying hot water, and when we set up a boiler system, we have to kind of know what do we need for water temps to make this happen. And from a performance standpoint, the warmer the water, generally, the higher the capacity. And how are they rating these systems? And nobody here wants to put a system in and then only to find out the customer's not very happy with it. So I want to first describe that. So, well, let's take a look at the first thing I want to address is the first hour rating. And on my water heater system that we have, I'm going to point this out. You'll notice in this sheet here, they identify something called first hour rating in gallons per hour. Now, specifically what that means is that first hour rating is essentially the number of gallons of hot water that water heater or the heater can supply per hour. And that's assuming you're starting with a full tank of hot water. Obviously, it'll depend upon the tank capacity. You're going to have to look at the source of the heat. So how many BTUs is your boiler system? Or in our case, it would be boiler system. And then obviously, so it's really a factor of what do you have for reserve, and also what do you have for BTUs that you're putting into it is primarily what we're looking at. So if we take a look at a rating system, I think some of this that I just described will stand out. So some of the factors here is BTU or boiler capacity, and they're identifying this as MBH. M is Roman numeral for 1,000. So it's in thousands of BTUs per hour that you're feeding to this system. And so whether it's a 50, a 70, a 90, 110,000 BTU application, whatever those BTUs for that boiler is, as well as the circulator GPM. So what specifically they're referring to is what am I supplying to from the boiler, through the boiler, to the domestic hot water heater heat exchanger is what we would have to do. Now, all of these water heaters have some sort of an emitter that would be shown into these. So I'm just going to pull up an image on the Amtrol tank. And as you can see, on the very bottom of this Amtrol tank, there is a heater. Now, this is just one example where they have a coil heater that is providing the source for that heat from the boiler system. There are other systems out there where they will have a tank within a tank. So they might have an application where they've got a water heater, and then they'll have another heater jacket around the outside of the water heater that's full of the boiler water. And then, of course, your domestic water water heat's coming from this tank, and the boiler in and out will come from the other tank, from the outer tank. There's multiple ways to do it. It's really a matter of if you're trying to compare a couple of water heaters that you'd be using for a customer, I guess the things that you'd be looking at is more of capacity and performance and function and longevity. Is how is it going to work? So let's take a look at this one. So I wanted to hit up on specifically, how would I determine and figure out a rating system for this? So what I wanted to do was show, if I take a look at let's say a 70,000 BTU boiler in this example. So here we've got a 70,000 BTU application. So I'm going to show this one, okay, 70,000. And this 70,000 BTU application, assuming that, let's say that I happen to have a 40-gallon water heater, or what they're calling the Gold Plus 40. So what it would show me in this particular case is if I happen to supply, or if I happen to be providing in that tank, so my tank is sitting there at 115 degree water, which I say 115 because typically most people do not want to have their water heater higher than 120 degrees just due to the scalding effect that would be a problem. So without some sort of tempering valve on that. Now, it's important to recognize that that's a consideration. So if you're sitting there with a tank that's got 40 gallons of 115 degree water, your first hour rating for that water heater would tell you that you would have available to you 160 gallons in the first hour of hot water that would be available to you. Now there are some assumptions. The first hour ratings down below here, they identify that we're dealing with, in this case, either 115 or 140 of the domestic outlet water temp, a 50 degree domestic inlet water temp that would be coming from the city sewer or city well system or city water supply system. The boiler water temperature from that boiler to the water heater would be 200 degrees, and then obviously we're looking at having proper flow rates. So generally that is going to help us a little bit in this case. So first hour rating being 160 gallons of water that you would get in the first hour. And again, those are the couple of assumptions. Now the flow rate that I need to be able to do that would be 9 gallons a minute. Now why is that important? Well, I think primarily because if you're going to be piping a circuit, you're going to want to look at how in the world am I going to get 9 gallons a minute through that circuit if I want that customer to have that performance. So you may have to run that as a 1-inch loop, potentially, depending on the length and the resistance of that circuit. But you're going to have to be careful with that. Flow rate is going to be fairly important on that. Now, let's take a look at what would be the impact if I have 140 degrees in this water tank. So the first hour rating of that system would now only be down to 120 gallons when you're assuming that you're dealing with the 140 degree water in that tank. So what they're telling you is that your first hour rating goes down a little bit, but you also have more reserve. That would be in that tank as well, because you're now sitting there with 40 gallons of 140 degree water as opposed to the 115 degree water. So it's logical that we would end up with a lower output, but you really have in actuality more capacity that's available to you. So that's kind of one way to look at it. So this is that's one of the ways to see this. So if we take a look at, let's say, a larger system, and what effect does that do for me? So if I have a 40 versus a 60, or the most common sizes are probably going to be the 40-gallon water heater, but if I go to a 60-gallon water heater, you'll notice that it doesn't have a significant, for this particular one, it doesn't have a huge effect at the 70,000 BTUs. Now, even if you jump it up to a 110,000 BTU boiler system, you'll notice that the first hour rating now jumps from 160 up to 235. So I think the point that I want to make here is that the boiler BTUs you're putting into those loops is going to have a very substantial impact on the actual recovery and how much water you are going to have available for your customer. It almost, if you kind of consider, or you almost think about, what would a person do if they had one of these high capacity indirect or high capacity instantaneous water heaters, what makes them give you so many BTUs or so much water capacity is the fact that they're putting such a high amount of BTUs into the water that's being used to obviously heat that water. And that's really probably the biggest takeaway that you should probably get from that, is that the more BTUs I put into that loop or into that tank or into that water heater, the faster it's going to warm up my water, and that customer is going to get more capacity. So that's a little bit on how the water heater systems are rated.